There is a generation living among us right now that raised themselves, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. They came home to empty houses, made their own meals, solved their own problems, and learned before they were old enough to drive that the world was not going to pause and wait for them to be ready. And somehow, nobody talks about them. We spend enormous amounts of time analyzing baby boomers and their post-war optimism. We write endless think pieces about millennials and their economic anxieties. We treat Generation Z like a fascinating cultural experiment playing out in real time. But there is this entire generation sitting right in the middle of all that noise, watching the conversation happen around them, unbothered, unsurprised, and completely used to being overlooked. Generation X, born roughly between 1964 and 1980. The generation that built the modern internet but doesn't post selfies. The generation that survived genuine instability but doesn't talk about their feelings. The generation that is probably the most psychologically complex group of people alive today, and yet somehow remains the least studied, the least celebrated, and the least understood. This video is going to change that. Because what happened to Generation X during their childhood and adolescence was not just a series of cultural events. It was a systematic psychological conditioning that shaped how they think, how they work, how they love, how they lead, and why they are so fundamentally different from every generation that came before or after them. Let's start at the beginning. In 1970, the United States divorce rate was around 3.5 per 1,000 people. By 1979, it had nearly doubled to 5.3 per 1,000, according to data from the National Center for Health Statistics. That means that a massive wave of Gen X children grew up watching the foundational institution of family fracture in real time, often without explanation, often without therapy, and very often without any adult taking the time to explain what was actually happening. The message that communicated to a child's developing brain was not subtle. It said, "The things you rely on most can disappear without warning." At the same time, both parents entering the workforce became a widespread economic reality rather than an exception. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the labor force participation rate for married women with children under 18 rose from about 40% in 1970 to over 60% by 1985. These were not families making a lifestyle choice. These were families responding to economic pressure, to inflation, to the reshaping of an entire post-industrial economy. The result was a phenomenon that sociologists and developmental psychologists began documenting in the early 1980s. Self-care children, or as the media eventually named them, latchkey kids. A landmark study published in the journal Pediatrics in 1990 estimated that by the mid-1980s, somewhere between 5 and 7 million American children between the ages of 5 and 13 were regularly spending significant time alone and unsupervised after school. Not occasionally, regularly. Picture what that actually meant for a 9-year-old in 1977. You walk home from school alone. You let yourself in with a key you wear around your neck. There is no one there. There is no smartphone to call someone on. There is no way for anyone to know if you fell, if someone knocked on the door, if something went wrong. You make yourself a snack, you do your homework, and then you sit with your own thoughts in a quiet house until an adult eventually comes home. That experience, repeated hundreds of times across a childhood, does something very specific to a developing brain. Developmental psychologist Dr. Yuri Bronfenbrenner of Cornell University, whose ecological systems theory remains one of the most cited frameworks in child psychology, argued that consistent adult absence during key developmental periods teaches children to construct internal rather than external regulatory systems. In simple terms, they learn to manage their own emotions, their own fears, and their own problems because there is no external system available to do it for them. That is not a small thing. That is the foundational architecture of a personality. And then there was the social environment outside the home. Generation X grew up during the Cold War, and unlike previous generations who experienced it as geopolitical background noise, Gen X children experienced it at a deeply personal and visceral level. Nuclear drills were still practiced in some schools. The concept of mutually assured destruction was not just a policy term. It was something children heard about on the news, referenced by adults around them, and then were simply expected to carry on with their day. The early 1980s brought a particularly intense phase of Cold War anxiety. When the Soviet Union shot down Korean Airlines Flight 7 in 1983, and shortly after, when the television film The Day After aired and depicted a nuclear attack on a Kansas suburb in graphic detail, approximately 100 million Americans watched it, many of them Gen X children. ABC set up a mental health hotline afterward because viewer distress was so significant. What does it do to a child to be told, however indirectly, that civilization itself might not survive their lifetime? Psychologists who have studied generational trauma describe this as a form of ambient existential anxiety. It does not produce paralysis. Instead, it produces something more adaptive and more durable. It produces the psychological capacity to hold two contradictory ideas at the same time. To believe that things might be fine while simultaneously preparing for the possibility that they might not be. Clinical psychologists sometimes call this cognitive dissonance tolerance, and it is a trait that Generation X developed at an unusually young age. This is the deeper psychological root of what most people simply describe as Gen X cynicism. It is not cynicism in the nihilistic sense. It is something more sophisticated. It is the learned ability to function productively inside uncertainty, without needing reassurance, and without requiring the world to confirm that things are going to be okay before proceeding. The parenting style that shaped Gen X was fundamentally different from anything that came before or after it, and not just because parents were less present. When parents were present, the approach to discipline and emotional development was shaped by norms that would be considered psychologically harmful by modern standards. The emotional validation movement in parenting, pioneered by researchers like Dr. John Gottman at the University of Washington, did not gain mainstream traction until the late 1980s and 1990s. For most of Gen X's childhood, the prevailing cultural attitude toward children's emotional states was, essentially, manage them yourself. Children were expected to be tough. Emotional expression, particularly distress, was often met with impatience rather than empathy. Consequences for misbehavior were swift and frequently disproportionate. According to a 1985 Gallup poll, a significant majority of American parents at the time reported using physical discipline regularly, viewing it not as abuse, but as responsible parenting. The psychological consequence of growing up inside that framework is what researchers in the field of attachment theory describe as insecure avoidant attachment. Children who learn, consistently, that expressing emotional needs produces either no response or a negative response, adapt by suppressing those needs. They become outwardly competent, inwardly guarded, and deeply uncomfortable with vulnerability. Dr. Mary Ainsworth, whose foundational work on attachment patterns at Johns Hopkins University shaped decades of developmental psychology, demonstrated that this pattern is not a character flaw. It is an intelligent adaptation to a specific environment. In a world where vulnerability is not safe, the brain learns not to be vulnerable. That adaptation shows up today in every room where Gen X is present. Now let's talk about their relationship with work, because this is where Gen X psychology becomes genuinely fascinating. Generation X did not inherit the company loyalty model of their parents. They watched that model collapse in front of them. Between 1979 and 1983, the United States lost approximately 2.4 million manufacturing jobs, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics data. Entire communities that had been built around single industries saw those industries evaporate. Then in the late 1980s and into the 1990s, corporate downsizing became a formal business strategy rather than a last resort. Companies that were profitable were laying off workers to satisfy shareholders. People who had given 20 or 30 years of their lives to an employer were handed a cardboard box and a parking lot. Gen X watched their parents go through this. Some of them experienced it themselves, and the psychological message was loud and clear. Institutional loyalty is a losing bet, but here is the part that makes Gen X unique. Rather than responding with cynicism about work itself, they transferred their loyalty from institutions to something they could actually control: their own competence. Organizational psychologist Dr. Denise Rouse at Carnegie Mellon University has written extensively about what she calls the psychological contract between employees and employers, and how the mass layoffs of the late 20th century fundamentally altered that contract for Gen X. Her research suggests that Gen X workers developed what she describes as a transactional rather than relational employment mindset. They work hard. They work very hard. But they work hard to build skills that belong to them, not to any company. This explains something that confuses younger managers who supervise Gen X employees. These workers are deeply competent, often the most capable people in the room, and yet they seem strangely unbothered by recognition or advancement politics. They are not playing the game of visibility because they never believed visibility was the point. The point is being genuinely good at what you do, so that when the rug gets pulled and they fully expect the rug to eventually get pulled, you land on your feet. There is another dimension to Gen X psychology that is almost never discussed, and it has to do with how they process information. Before the internet became a household utility, knowledge was fundamentally a different kind of resource. It was physical. It was located. It required effort to obtain. If you wanted to know something in 1983, you went to the library. You navigated the card catalog system, which organized books by subject, title, and author across physical index cards stored in wooden drawers. You might spend an hour finding a single relevant book. You might discover the book was checked out. You might have to request it from another library through an interlibrary loan system that could take weeks. Cognitive neuroscientists studying memory encoding have consistently found that information acquired through effortful retrieval is retained more durably than information acquired passively. A 2008 study published in the journal Psychological Science by researchers Jeffrey Karpik and Henry Roediger found that retrieval practice, meaning active effort to locate and extract information, significantly strengthens long-term memory compared to passive review. Generation X, by accident of birth timing, spent their entire educational development engaged in effortful retrieval. Every fact they know cost them something to obtain. This created a generation of people who are unusually skeptical of information they haven't personally verified, deeply comfortable with not knowing something immediately, and remarkably capable of thinking through problems without external reference. They are also, not coincidentally, very good with their hands. When something broke in a Gen X household, the instinct was not to hire someone or look up a tutorial. The instinct was to take the thing apart and figure out how it worked. This hands-on problem-solving orientation built what cognitive psychologists call mechanical reasoning fluency, an intuitive ability to understand how physical systems work and how to manipulate them toward a desired outcome. Now we need to talk about something that defines Gen X in popular culture, but is rarely analyzed with any psychological depth: their humor. Gen X humor is deeply ironic, frequently self-deprecating, and almost always holds emotional distance at its center. Think of the films that define their young adult years: Clerks, Reality Bites, Singles, Heathers, Office Space. These were not stories about triumph or transformation. They were stories about people navigating an absurd world with a carefully maintained sense of detachment. That detachment is not accidental. It is protective. Dr. Rod Martin, a professor emeritus of psychology at the University of Western Ontario and one of the world's leading researchers on humor, has studied the relationship between irony and psychological resilience extensively. His research suggests that ironic humor, which holds multiple conflicting perspectives simultaneously and refuses to fully commit to any of them, serves as a genuine emotional buffer against anxiety and disappointment. For a generation raised on the expectation of disappointment, irony was not a style. It was a survival strategy. If you have already decided nothing is going to work out, and you say so in a way that makes everyone laugh, you have protected yourself against both failure and the embarrassment of having hoped. You can care deeply about something while simultaneously projecting that you don't. Gen X mastered this balance before they were teenagers. And yet, underneath all of that armor, something consistently surprises people who work closely with Gen X: their loyalty. Not institutional loyalty. Not performative loyalty. The kind that shows up quietly, without announcement, and stays. Because when you are 8 years old and both your parents are working and you need someone to talk to, the people who show up are your friends. And you remember that. You remember every person who sat with you in that empty house or that school hallway or that parking lot when they didn't have to. And you carry that for the rest of your life. Research published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology has found that individuals with avoidant attachment styles, which Gen X disproportionately exhibits, form fewer deep relationships but demonstrate unusually high levels of loyalty and reliability within those relationships. The bonds they do form tend to be forged through shared experience rather than shared ideology, through presence rather than declaration. Gen X will not tell you they love you very often, but they will drive 4 hours at midnight if you call. There is one more piece of the Gen X psychological portrait that deserves honest attention: the economic wounds. Generation X was hit repeatedly by forces that were entirely outside their control and for which they received very little sympathy. The youngest members of the generation graduated college directly into the wreckage of the dot-com crash of 2000 and 2001, which wiped out trillions of dollars in market value and eliminated hundreds of thousands of jobs in the technology sector that many of them had trained to enter. Then, just as many Gen Xers were reaching their peak earning years and beginning to build real financial stability, the 2008 financial crisis arrived. According to a 2010 study by the Pew Research Center, Gen X lost a higher percentage of their total household wealth during the financial crisis than any other generation, including baby boomers, because they had been in the workforce long enough to accumulate assets but not long enough to have adequately diversified them. They rebuilt, quietly, without a great deal of public acknowledgement that anything particularly difficult had happened to them. The result, psychologically, is a generation that has a very realistic relationship with financial security. They are not pessimistic about money. They are precise about it. They understand from direct and repeated experience that wealth can evaporate and that the only reliable hedge against that is skill, adaptability, and the kind of resourcefulness you build by doing things yourself. What makes all of this genuinely moving, when you sit with it long enough, is that Generation X took everything they experienced and did not become bitter. They did not become demanding. They did not build a cultural identity around their suffering or expect the world to acknowledge what they had been through. They just quietly became some of the most competent, adaptable, self-sufficient, and fiercely loyal people in the modern workforce and in modern families. They raised their own children with the kind of attention and emotional presence they never had. Many of them became the parents they had needed, which is its own kind of extraordinary psychological transformation. They are the bridge generation, the ones who remember what life was like before everything became digital and instant and mediated through a screen. The ones who can exist comfortably in both worlds. The ones who built the infrastructure of the modern world and then stepped back and let other generations take the credit without feeling the need to make a point of it. Dr. Jean Twenge, a psychology professor at San Diego State University and author of extensive research on generational personality differences, has noted that Generation X scores consistently higher on measures of psychological autonomy and self-directedness than both boomers and millennials. They are, she writes, uniquely equipped to function under conditions of uncertainty and rapid change, which, if you look at the world right now, sounds less like a generational trait and more like a superpower. Generation X will not watch this video and feel particularly validated or seen. That is not really what they are looking for. They will probably watch it, agree with parts, disagree with parts, make a dry comment about it to no one in particular, and move on with their day. But they deserve to be understood, not because they are asking for it, precisely because they are not. The generation that taught itself to need nothing is still out there, still showing up, still doing the work, still holding the bridge together, and now you know why. If this gave you a new way of thinking about the people around you, share it with someone who deserves to be understood a little better. And if you want more deep dives into generational psychology and human behavior, subscribe and stay with us.